The first speaker is Andrew Ng, and he's going to speak about unsupervised feature learning and deep learning. He's done lots and lots of great work, and there's many things I could say, but he said I should just keep it short and let him get up and give his talk. His research interests are machine learning, reinforcement learning, and robotic control, and he'll share some of his work with us now.
Thanks, Ali. Tell you a bit about unsupervised feature learning and deep learning. I know that most of us in this room care primarily about computer vision, but I'm going to develop these ideas using computer vision as well as examples drawn from audio and text. Let's say you want to do image classification, right? What you do is you take an image and you feed it to a learning algorithm, and it learns to classify it as a motorcycle or not. All of us know this picture isn't really like this. What we do is we actually take the image and we construct a feature representation, and it's that feature representation that we feed to, say, our support vector machine. More generally, this type of pipeline is pervasive in computer vision and in other domains where there's this sort of low-level features is what we actually feed to the learning algorithm. In fact, if you look more broadly across computer perception, right, in vision, we don't feed the images to learning algorithms. We feed low-level features like edge detectors or SIFT or other things. If you have an audio application, you don't feed the raw audio. You feed instead, various audio features to do, say, speaker identification. And similarly, in natural language processing, when you do machine learning on text, you feed various text features to do the applications you actually care about. Given that this pipeline is what almost all of our learning algorithms, almost all our vision and other applications do, the low-level features in the middle is the primary lens through which our learning algorithms sees the world. And so this gives them a certain degree of primacy. And what I want to talk about today is sort of where do these features come from? So let's actually look at what we do right now, right? In computer vision, where do we get these features from? Well, in computer vision, the state-of-the-art answer is, over the last few decades, our community has spent a lot of effort hand-designing or hand-engineering these features. And as a result of several decades of work, we've now found some, pretty good features, but it was a long process. And so I've asked, can we do better than this? That's vision. How about audio? In audio, the state-of-the-art answer is, over the last few decades, there's an entirely separate community of audio researchers that's been designing, putting a lot of insight into coding out good audio features. And some of these are incredibly clever ideas, like MFCCs. Actually, it's like, 20, 30 years old. It's actually very hard to beat. But again, you have to ask, is there a better way to come up with features than to have a whole community of researchers trying to design these things by hand? And for text, same thing, right? In fact, a good fraction of NLP research today is just in coming up with, say, better parsers. And what are parsers good for? Well, they're primarily used as a feature into other things. Or name entity extraction, you don't actually use that for, or semantic row labeling. Most of these things are designed to be used as features for later learning algorithms. So is there a better way? Is there maybe a better way to come up with maybe better features and to do so with less of our time and our grad students' time? So the work I'm going to talk about takes some inspiration from biology, and I want to share with you some of that. Like many of you, I tend to treat biological inspiration with great caution and often a healthy dose of skepticism, but some of this is actually really cool, so I want to share that with you. So it turns out there's a fascinating hypothesis that a lot of human perception, a lot of biological perception, can be explained by a single learning algorithm. Okay, this is a hypothesis, so this is not really proof. But let me share with you some of the evidence for that. And this idea has been around for several decades, so recently popularized by Jeff Hawkins. This is an idea that's been around for at least 3 decades. In that image, that red part of your brain, right, shaded red, that's your auditory cortex. The way you're understanding my words now is that your ears are taking the sound signal and is sending the sound signal to the auditory cortex, which is that little red part of your brain, and that part of your brain is a part, it figures out what I'm saying, right, processes the sound. So what neuroscientists did, Rowe et al. At MIT, did was they took a number of animals and they essentially cut the wire between the ear and the auditory cortex. and rewire the brain so that the optic nerve, or rather so that the signal from the optic nerve gets routed to the auditory cortex. And what you find if you do this is that the auditory cortex learns to see. Okay, and this is actually not controversial. This is replicated in multiple labs in at least 4 species of animals, and these animals can do behavioral tasks. You can do visual discrimination tasks, with their auditory cortex. The same rewiring experiment also works for your somatosensory cortex. So you can rewire this to the part of your brain responsible for touch processing that will learn to see with a totally different part of your brain. And more broadly, it turns out this is evidence that, so if you look at the auditory cortex, right, what that means is that the same piece of brain tissue can process sight or sound, or maybe touch. And if the same piece of brain tissue can process sight or sound or touch, then maybe there's actually one learning algorithm, or maybe there's one algorithm that can process sight or sound or touch. And can we discover what that algorithm is? Just other quick examples. On the bottom is an example of seeing with your tongue. This is a system called BrainPort undergoing FDA trials. The way it works is this is being used to help blind people see, right? So you strap a camera to your forehead, takes a grayscale image of what's in front of you, and it impresses that grayscale image onto a rectangular array of electrodes on your tongue, and so that a high voltage corresponds to a dark pixel and a low voltage corresponds to a light pixel, so like 2D array of electrodes on your tongue. And with tens of minutes of training, we can actually, you and I would be able to learn to see with our tongues. Human echolocation. So you can do this either by snapping your fingers. This room has good acoustics, it's hard to tell. But by either snapping your fingers or clicking your tongue, humans can learn to interpret the pattern of sounds bouncing off the environment as sonar. And if you search on the internet, there are amazing videos of this kid with no eyeballs. Tragically, there was a kid whose eyeballs were physically removed because of cancer. But there's a kid with no eyeballs who can, by snapping his fingers, walk around and not hit anything. He can ride a skateboard, shoot a basketball into a hoop. Okay. And the examples just go on and on. There's a haptic belt that gives humans the direction sense. You can implant a third eye in an animal and learn to use the third eye. And there's actually a surprising wealth of evidence that suggests, to some extent, you can take any of a large range of sensors and plug them into a brain, and very often, not always, very often the brain will figure out what to do with it. So the question that excites me is there some fundamental principle that underlies perception, and can we figure out what that is? And use this for computer vision, of course, because that's what we want to solve. So just to summarize this, right? So I've been ranting on philosophy a little bit. I think there are sort of two possible approaches to doing computer vision. We all know that the adult visual system is incredibly complicated. So one approach to computer vision is to try to directly implement what the adult visual system is doing. So, we can implement features to capture different types of invariants, context, capture relations between object parts, 3D structure, and so on. And maybe we can implement the visual system. Or if we think, and no one can prove this, but if I believe, and maybe I'm wrong, but if we believe that there's a more general principle, more general computational principle that underlies perception, maybe not even just computer vision, but it's a more general algorithm that underlies perception, maybe that discovering what that algorithm is may turn out to be much simpler than capturing, what the trained adult visual system can do. Okay, so we'll talk a bit about this research agenda. And of course, this research agenda, I started working on this 5 years ago, but now this is an agenda shared by many researchers in machine learning. And I should say there are probably people that have been working on this for like 30 years. Right? So concretely, here's the problem I want to pose. Can I give your learning algorithm a set of images and have you find a better way to represent images than the raw input pixels? And if you can do that, maybe I can show the same learning algorithm a bunch of audio and have you find a better way to represent audio than the raw waveforms. So as a concrete example, just to really formalize what I mean by that, here's a concrete instantiation of the problem. Given a 14 by 14 image patch X, one way to represent it is to use 196 real numbers, like 196 pixel intensity values. Problem I want to pose is, can you find a better vector? Can you find a better feature vector to represent that 14 by 14 image patch than the raw pixel intensity values? Okay, and we know how to hand design things, but can you learn something automatically? And in order to sort of really evaluate this framework and sort of test in the formal machine learning framework, let's actually pose a formal learning problem. So this is a standard supervised learning problem where maybe I give you a small number of examples of cars, small number of examples of motorcycles, and then you learn, and in the test I say, what is that at the bottom? A few years ago, we posed the unsupervised feature learning formalism. We call that self-taught learning, in which the challenge is, in addition to your labeled examples, we're going to give you a ton of unlabeled images, maybe random internet images. And the challenge is, can those random images down on the bottom left, can they help you figure out that that test set example on the bottom right is a car? Okay. And so concretely, one natural thing you might try to do, if we can come up with an algorithm, is to take all the unlabeled images, learn a better representation for images, and then use that better representation to learn to distinguish between cars and motorcycles. Okay. So how do you do that? So it turns out there's an algorithm that was originally invented by neuroscientists, Bruno Oshausen and David Fiup, that actually works for this task. So Bruno and David are neuroscientists, and this was originally conceived as a neuroscience, like a theoretical neuroscience piece of work for how part of the brain, visual cortex works. And when they invented it, I don't think they ever had in mind that this would be used for machine learning. But so 5 years ago, we proposed to use this for machine learning, and let me share with you how we actually went about doing that. So this is how sparse coding works. Sparse coding is an unsupervised learning algorithm, and we're going to give the algorithm a set of images x1 through xm. Okay, so each of these images is, say, an n by n image patch, like a 14 by 14 image. What sparse coding does is it learns a dictionary of basis functions, phi1 through phi k, let's say 64 basis functions, so that each input x can be approximately decomposed as a linear combination of your basis functions, subject to the constraint that the AJs are row numbers, so subject to the constraint that the AJs are mostly 0. And then that's hence the term sparse. Okay, this is my only equation on this talk, although let me actually re-explain this in pictures. So this is what sparse coding does. We train sparse coding by taking a set of natural images and cutting out random patches and feeding that to the learning algorithm. What the learning algorithm does is it learns, in this case, 64 basis functions, phi1 through phi 64, shown on the upper right. And you see that those basis functions correspond roughly to edges, right, like Gabor edge detectors. When you give the algorithm a new test example, what it does is it selects out a small subset of your 64 basis functions, and it expresses your test example as a linear combination of just that small subset of your 64 basis functions. Okay, and so you can think of this as saying that that test example x is 0.8 times basis 36 plus 0.3 times basis 42 and so on. And because we're using only 3 out of 64 of these basis functions, this is a very sparse vector, right? Most of the coefficients are equal to 0 because we have only 3 non-zero coefficients. Speaking informally, what this algorithm has done is it has taken your image x and it has decomposed your image patch x in terms of what edges appear in the image, right? It's saying that your image x is about 0.8 of edge number 36 plus 0.3 of edge number 42 plus 0.5 of edge number 63. And so speaking loosely, this is an algorithm that has, quote, invented edge detection. And if you look at the vector at the bottom, the A1 up to A64 equals that vector of coefficients. That vector, right, that vector A1 through A64 of your coefficients, this is now a new feature vector for representing my image patch. And this expresses the image in terms of what edges appear in it, rather than in terms of the raw pixel intensity values. Okay, just a couple more examples. And as you can imagine, by taking an image and expressing the image and by representing the image in terms of what edges appear in the image, rather than in terms of the raw pixel intensity values, this is a much better representation, right, for the various computer vision tasks we want to do. And just and so just be really concrete, right? That if you look at one of those vectors, the A1 through A64, you can now feed that vector into your learning algorithm, into your support vector machine or other learning algorithm, instead of feeding in your raw pixel intensity values. And hopefully this is now a better representation to do, standard vision tasks. Okay. Finally, other authors, Van Hatter and Van der Schaaf, showed that the output of this algorithm is actually quantitatively similar on many dimensions, not all, but quantitatively similar to primary visual cortex, early vision in the biological brain. So that was vision. How about audio? I'm going to mostly talk about vision, but I think it's interesting to think more broadly about perception. So Evan Smith, Evan was a postdoc at Stanford with Jay McClellan. But what Evan did was he took sparse coding and applied it to raw audio data, and this figure shows 20 basis functions that he learned applying sparse coding to audio. What Evan did was he then went to the cat auditory processing system, and for each of the 20 basis functions, he found the closest match, the closest analog in the cat or in biological auditory processing system. And so the blue functions are those learned by sparse coding on audio. And if you take the closest matches in biology, that's shown overlaid in red. Okay. And so this is an algorithm that, on the one hand, gives a good explanation for early visual processing, which we know early V1, right, is doing edge detection. And it gives a good explanation for early auditory processing. Again, not on all dimensions, but some surprisingly many. It turns out this is work done by Andrew Sachs, student at Stanford, worked with me. What Andrew Sachs did was he actually collected touch data, following the way that animals use their hands in the wild, and actually demonstrated that in some respects, this sort of model is a good explanation for somatosensory processing as well. So just mapping this back to vision, right? We now have an algorithm that can invent edge detection. It gives us somewhat better representation for images than the raw pixel intensity values. It turns out that the person who's done probably the most amazing work applying these ideas is Kai Yu. He's going to talk more about that. I'm going to instead take this in a different direction, which is can we go beyond edges, right? Or how else can we extend this? So let's see. So if you imagine in this diagram that the lowest level are the input image, one level up, you can apply sparse coding and learn edge detectors. It turns out you can repeat this process, and just as you can group together pixels to form edges, you can group together edges to form more complex feature detectors to build more and more complex features. The technical details of this is with either a sparse version of Jeff Hinton's DBN or a sparse autoencoder. But when you do this, let me actually show you the results. So one layer of sparse coding or one layer of sparse DBN lets you group together pixels to form edges. Okay, and again, just to be really concrete about what this means, where's my mouse? This basis there are 24 basis functions here, and this one on the upper left, that's an edge detector, detecting edges at like a 85-degree angle. So what this visualizes is this says that I have one feature that says, do I have an edge at that orientation? Okay. When you repeat this process, this is the result of training the algorithm on faces. What you find is that at the next level up, you find detectors for object parts, and another level up, you find detectors for more complete models of faces. So concretely, this is a feature detector that fires whenever there's like maybe an eyebrow, and this is a detector that fires whenever it sees the side of the nose. These are all visualizations of very complicated nonlinear functions, but this is our attempt to visualize the process of recursively applying this algorithm. And you can imagine if you want to do various things with faces, these sorts of features could be very useful. And all this is learned from unlabeled data, right? If you train these algorithms on different object types, you get different, the similar sort of edges, then object part, then complete object model decomposition. For example, if you train this on cars, you get parts of cars and then more complete models of cars. And if you train this sort of model on multiple object classes, then at intermediate levels you get features that are shared amongst object classes, and then at the highest level you get object-specific classes. So this shows at least that we can learn interesting features, but what is this all good for? So let's talk a bit about machine learning applications. The Hollywood 2 dataset is a standard benchmark in computer activity video activity recognition, and the task is you watch a short snippet of a Hollywood movie, and then you recognize whether any of a large number of activities that occurred there. You recognize whether, I don't remember the exact list, things like whether someone two people hug, whether two shook hands, whether two kiss, whether someone's running, activities like that. So over the last few years, various authors referenced here have developed and used fairly sophisticated algorithms, fairly sophisticated features to do activity recognition on Hollywood too. And over the last few years, there's been substantial progress. But using unsupervised feature learning, you actually get significantly better results than any of the previous work. Okay. That's images. How about audio? So it turns out that you can take the same sorts of algorithms and apply them to audio. So what's shown on top is a spectrogram. So what you can do is take snippets of spectrograms and apply sparse coding to say, spectrogram data. And if you do that, then it learns to decompose spectrogram snippets in terms of sparse linear combinations of basis functions like that. And if you look at the basis functions learned by sparse coding or by sparse DBN, these sort of sparse learning algorithms, this is an example of a set of the first layer dictionary of basis functions learned by the algorithm. You find that many of these basis functions seem to correspond to phonemes. And so just as sparse coding applied to images, quote, invents edge detection, the same algorithm applied to audio, quote, invents phoneme detection, applied to speech. And then you can apply this recursive idea again. So this is a sparse DBN. So we'll take the spectrogram, throw on top a layer of sparse DBN nodes like that, and then learn additional layers of features on top. And again, just to be really clear, right? This is a graphical model, and the way we're extracting features from this is we have as input the spectrogram, and then we're going to compute the posterior mean of each of these nodes at the top. So this gives me, two numbers in this representation, but these numbers are then my feature representation for this spectrogram input, and is, the posterior mean of those graphical models. That gives me a vector. That's what I feed to my learning algorithm to do, various audio tasks. So the TIMIT benchmark is a standard benchmark in phoneme classification. And audio researchers compete on this benchmark. I should say this is not the benchmark that audio researchers compete most intensely on of all the benchmarks, but this is one of those data sets where, if you do 0.1% better on this data set, you write a paper on it. So over the last decade, there was a 1.6% worth of progress on this data set. And a couple of years ago, Hong Lak, former student, was able to make 1.1% progress. That's like 2/3 of a decade of progress on like a pretty significant audio benchmark. And the thing I like about this is that, so when Hong Lak and Peter Pham, as an undergrad, and I were doing this work, none of us actually know that much about audio. None of us are experts in audio, but because Hong Lak, not an expert in vision, not an expert in audio, but by being only an expert in machine learning, was able to compete with audio researchers on the home turf. Right? So what are the challenges that face unsupervised feature learning and deep learning? So there's actually a large community of people, certainly not just me, developing unsupervised feature learning and deep learning algorithms. I'm going to very briefly share with you what I think is one of the main technical challenges, which is just the idea of scaling up. So Adam Coates ran an interesting experiment of taking different unsupervised feature learning algorithms shown in different colors and scaling them up to different degrees. So the different colors, the different lines correspond to different algorithms. The vertical axis is performance, and the horizontal axis is the size of these models, the number of features you learn. And the trend is actually incredibly clear, right? The larger you can scale up these models, the better it does. And very often, even a simpler algorithm, if you can scale it to learn more features or just learn from more data and learn more features, will do better. And so over the last few years, I actually feel like one of the main technical challenges facing unsupervised feature learning is how do we come up with efficient algorithms to scale up these algorithms? And I don't really want to talk about this, but concretely, Proposal's formalism in I guess, 2006, Rejet was the first to do apply GPUs to this problem. Now essentially everyone in deep learning is using GPUs, and various other ideas for scaling up these algorithms. I don't want to talk. I actually don't want to go into the technical details on these today, but by scaling up these algorithms, we were able to get state-of-the-art results on many machine learning, image, audio, and so on tasks. So as I was preparing this talk, I asked my students to summarize for me all the data sets on which we have a sort of state-of-the-art result, meaning superior to the best published result. And I was actually surprised. There are actually quite a lot more of these than I realized. But on audio, I talked about that already. Images, I should say images, I believe there's one unpublished result that may have surpassed us now, but I think we're superior to all published results. Video, when Quark tried these algorithms out on all the standard, so many of the most standard video activity recognition benchmarks, all of these surpass the human design features, let's say, and multimodal classification. Once again, I should say this is, unsupervised feature learning, deep learning is a rapidly growing area of ICML, of machine learning. So I'm certainly not the only one working on this. Just other state-of-the-art type results. I believe, I'm not 100% sure, I believe Jan LeCun may have the best pedestrian detector. Not 100% sure of that. Phony recognition. We were the first to get a state-of-the-art result for audio timid. More recently, Jeff Hinton has also gotten a state-of-the-art result on a different phone recognition task, and Kai has perhaps more than anyone else, gotten really amazing results on images. I'll leave him to talk about that. When I give talks where Kai isn't following me, I usually have 1 or 2 slides on his work, but I won't do that today. So that's sort of the state of a lot of what we and other groups are doing in unsupervised feature learning and deep learning. In the last how much time do I have? 10, 15, whatever, half hour, 30, 40, 50 minutes. Okay. Okay, thanks. Thank you. So in the last 10 minutes, what I want to do is talk about some more speculative, future-looking, exciting, maybe bleeding edge stuff. It's the idea of learning recursive representations. And this is one direction of several that we're trying to extend these ideas. So what I'm going to do is actually develop these ideas in the context of text, and then I promise I'll take these ideas and actually apply them to computer vision and images again. Okay? So it turns out, let's say I have an English sentence, like the cat sat on the mat, and I want to learn a feature representation for this sentence, the cat sat on the mat. The sort of standard approach would maybe start as follows. First, we're going to take each word and just encode each word using a feature representation. You can think of this as a one hot vector representation or a one on vector indicating which word it is. We usually use other representations like an LDA representation, or there are a few people, Yoshi Benjo, Jason Weston, Marshall Colliber, have done very exciting work learning some distributional similarity type ideas. We can basically take each word and represent each word via a feature vector. And if you want to think of this as a one hot feature vector, or think of it as an LDA or a PCA vector, but it's there are clever things, but I don't really want to talk about that. Now, what you can do is throw on top a standard, generic structured, right, graphical model or autoencoder or neural network or whatever. But if you look at that node, say, it turns out this sort of generic hierarchy, it sort of doesn't really make sense for text, right? Because that node where the arrow is pointing, it sees the input cat sat on, and so is sort of the job of that node to represent the phrase cat sat on. But the phrase cat sat on is not even a proper English phrase. It doesn't mean anything, right? So, how do you represent, it doesn't make sense to try to represent the phrase cat sat on. It just doesn't mean anything. In contrast, because text or language has a natural hierarchy, what we'd like to do is learn a representation that respects the natural hierarchy of language. And concretely, we know the cat is a noun phrase, the mat is a noun phrase, and so on. And what we'd like to do is learn a feature representation that respects the natural parse tree or the natural hierarchy that's implied by this English sentence. And if you look at that node, that's called a prepositional phrase. It's the job of that node to represent the phrase on the mat. And now the phrase on the mat, you can imagine something sitting on the mat. You can imagine on the mat has a meaning. We can think about how to learn a feature representation for the phrase on the mat. And concretely, just as we were taking images like image patches and coming up with a feature vector to represent an image patch, we like to do the same thing. We want to take any English sentence or take any English phrase and learn a feature vector, like just drawn as A3 there as just for illustration. We like to learn a feature vector to represent the quote meaning of each of these phrases. So just one half a slide on how we do this. The basic unit of computation in our learning algorithm is what's called a recursive neural network. And that's a neural network that takes as input the two children nodes, and it outputs the feature representation of the parent node in this hierarchy. Okay, so Richard Socher implemented this, and this allows you to recursively compute the feature you want for the parent node as a function of the features you have for the children node. And you can train this at a large scale, train all this in one discriminatively trained framework with one optimization objective and run the whole thing, and it converges. So what you can do is apply this idea to parse sentences. I should say this algorithm actually discovers the structure of the parse tree and the representation. So details. So what you can do is actually apply this to parse natural language sentences. So given a sentence like, a small crowd enters the historic church, you can now take as input, say, a representation for the and a representation for historic church, and use the recursive neural network to compute the representation for the parent, right? Again, at each node, we have a feature vector that represents that node. And it turns out you can apply the same idea to images. So given an image like this, there's a natural hierarchy, right, of this image. So you think of it as a decomposition of the image into parts, right, into object parts and subparts. So at the bottom is a superpixel segmentation of the image, and there's actually a natural hierarchy in which this part of the building where my mouse cursor is pointing combines with a window to form like a little bit bigger chunk of the building. These things combine with a roof, right, to form the building, and so on. And so there's sort of a natural hierarchy of parts and object subparts in many of these images. And you can apply the same recursive neural network formalism so that you have feature representations for the low-level parts, and you can recursively combine the children in order to learn representations for every node in this hierarchy. Okay? So the cool thing about this is that each node in the hierarchy has a feature vector representation, right? We started off with features of the bottom level leaf nodes. And as we merge the leaf nodes to form larger and larger chunks of the image, we're recursively computing a feature vector for every node in this tree. Okay? What you can do, therefore, is select a node in your tree and ask what other nodes have features similar to this node that I just selected, right? And this is a figure that shows that. So on the leftmost patch is, we selected a node on the tree and looked at the superpixel or union of superpixels or whatever in one node of the tree. And then we looked through our large database of images and said, what other image patches get mapped to the most similar feature vector as this one? And the 9 images on the right are the most similar neighbors. And so you kind of see that, somehow, right, semantically or maybe visually similar things get mapped to similar feature vectors. So for example, in the third row, right, that fragment of a car, well, what's most similar to that fragment of a car? Well, it's these other fragments of cars. More importantly, you can apply these sorts of features to standard vision tasks. All this work is somewhat preliminary, but Richard showed that using these features, you can outperform, many hand-designed features, actually pretty sophisticated hand-designed models on multi-class segmentation. This is work on the Stanford background data set. It wasn't collected by me. This is data collected by Stephen Gould as part of his thesis work. And he actually had a pretty darn complicated model for his thesis work, and these learned features outperform that. Just to wrap up, just applying the same ideas to text, we can, each sentence has a feature vector representation, because again, right, this sort of recursive neural network idea applies to text too. So what we can do is pick a sentence, which I'm calling the center sentence in the second column, and we can compute the feature representation for the center sentence and ask what other sentences get mapped, to locations similar in feature space to the center sentence, and that's shown in the right column, right? So this example, so this example at the bottom, the things that are similar to Columbia, South Carolina are Greenville, Mississippi, and unknown word Maryland. So even though, UNK is the parser's annotation for a word that's never seen before. So even though it's never seen this word before, it knows that unknown word Maryland is probably a similar sort of thing as Columbia, South Carolina. That's pretty cool. Just a few more examples. So the sentences are similar to has declined to comment, while the fourth most similar sentence is Coastal wouldn't disclose the terms. Right? Has declined to comment, it has no words in common with the phrase Coastal wouldn't disclose the terms. But we learn a feature representation for these two phrases that says that these two sentences are similar to each other. This is a useful representation for other NLT tasks. Right? Okay. And finally, you can evaluate this sort of algorithm, using more traditional NLP metrics like how well it works as a parser. Right now, we're a respectable parser, but also not superior to the state-of-the-art best hand-designed parsers. But it's a sort of ongoing, somewhat more preliminary work. Okay. So, one last slide, and then I'm done. What I've done is I've described a research agenda in unsupervised feature learning and deep learning. And over the last 5 years, I've been going around talking about this. I've heard, frankly, many weaknesses and criticisms of this work. And there are weaknesses and criticisms of this agenda that are valid. Just mention some of them and sort of acknowledge them and maybe try to address some of them as well. One criticism that I often hear is this, your algorithms are trying to learn everything. But we know a lot about images, and so it's better to encode the prior knowledge we have about images. Turns out there was a similar debate in NLP, in natural language processing, about 20 years ago. 20 years ago, there were the linguists who were building pretty sophisticated linguistic theories, and then there were like the dumb machine learning guys, guys like me, right, that like just want to apply learning algorithms to a ton of data and see what happens. 20 years later, it's actually really clear which side has carried the argument in NLP. And what I think, NLP researchers, what we realized was that language is an incredibly complex phenomenon, and there's no way for us to encode everything we need to know about language. Language is just so complex. You can't write down everything you need to know about language. And if your approach to solving NLP is by hand-tuning features a little bit at a time, or if your approach to solving NLP is to write down every single phenomena and then manually add one graphical model node for every phenomena you can think of in language, right? You're basically dead. Language is so complicated. If you want to do this one graphical node at a time or tuning one feature at a time, it's just never going to get there. I think the debate is still playing out in computer vision, and maybe vision is a simpler phenomenon than language, and maybe it is possible to build models that are complex enough to capture all the phenomena there are in images. But again, it depends on what you believe is true for images versus for language. Over the years, I've also heard a lot of criticisms of unsupervised feature learning of the form, unsupervised feature learning cannot currently do X, where X is many of those things on that list below. So it turns out all of these are valid criticisms. Many of these were true at the time, but are not true anymore. And, I think there is certainly still work to be done. There are still things at the bottom of this list. As we strike things off the bottom of this list, of course, we ourselves, as well as our colleagues and friends, help us to add more things to the bottom. So this is which is the way it should be. But so there's certainly work to be done, and there's certainly problems we have not yet solved. And finally, one of the criticism I hear that actually is a significant problem is that we don't understand the learned features. And when we apply these learning algorithms, they learn something. They learn some horribly complicated nonlinear function, and there are people working on visualization tools to understand these things, but we sort of don't understand them, and this actually is a serious problem. I think many vision features are also hard to understand, especially when you sort of use like these multiple kernel learning type methods to combine tons of other features. Well, what is the output? I don't know, but I think the fact that we don't understand the output of these algorithms actually is a problem. Okay. just to wrap up, I've talked about this agenda of unsupervised feature learning, and of, let's try to learn the feature representations. But of course, feature learning is just a narrow technical formalism of a problem. This problem isn't really about learning features, right? It's about understanding, is there some fundamental computational principle that underlies perception, that underlies maybe not just computer vision, but that underlies perception more broadly. And can we discover computational principles that underlie perception and implement that? Because that might be a much simpler way to solve vision or make progress in vision than to narrowly just implement things that we think the vision system should do. Talked about sparse coding and the deep learning variants, which proved very successful for various tasks. And finally, I know this talk has been light on technical details, and if you're a grad student, or if you're a researcher, and if you want to use these ideas, the best way to pick these things up is actually not by getting the details from like a talk like mine, but the best way is probably to actually look at the tutorial and work through, read through some technical things and read through programming exercises and so on. Stanford students and I have been working pretty hard on setting up online tutorials with the goal of actually bootstrapping people up to be able to apply these techniques to your problems. There's an extremely preliminary version up at that URL, but we're working on a more sophisticated tutorial with like a seriously, hopefully a serious, well-designed tutorial with readings and programming exercises to really get people up to speed as quickly as possible on using these things yourself on your problems. So email me if you'd like to point to that, and I'm certainly happy to share that. I should say, I was actually designing this for Stanford students. There's actually a selfish reason I was designing it, but happy to share it with others as well. And of course, unsupervised feature learning is a large community. So, if you know any of the other guys working on this, you should definitely, I'm certainly not the only proponent, but you should take ideas from this community and apply it to your work. Thank you very much.
There is time for some questions. I think if we say it loud enough, you could just repeat it so that. Okay.
I'm just curious what happens when your data isn't quote-unquote perfect. Let's take the case of images. Humans can interpret images even if they're noisy, blurry, et cetera, et cetera. How well does unsupervised feature learning work when you have those kind of imperfections in your data?
So the question is, what happens if your data isn't perfect? So humans can interpret noisy images with blurry and so on. So how about unsupervised feature learning? So I think it's a broad problem that holds true for all of computer vision, not just unsupervised feature learning. I'm not aware that we have a huge advantage or disadvantage, but I think people work on these problems as well. Please, actually, yeah.
As a practical manner, when you learn image features, of course, properties like scale and invariance, rotation invariance, shift invariance could all emerge out of your learning algorithm. But would you recommend, if somebody wants to solve a practical problem, to maybe put these into the actual feature learning and maybe get better scalability?
Yeah, it's a great question. Bernd's question is, we know that we want things like scale, rotation, translation, and variance. So should we put these things in their algorithms to get better scalability? So the answer to that is subtle. I think, yes is sort of a good idea. In fact, using convolutional nets, for example, hard code translation and variance, which gives you better scalability. That's sort of the yes answer. Here's a no answer, which is that what I see many people do, right? So this notion of these invariances is actually very seductive. There are like 5 or 6 types of invariances that we know about and can hard code. There's translation, rotation, scale, luminance, maybe 1 or 2 more, right? Scale, did I say that? And so what I see many people do is you can actually, turns out it's possible to embark on like a 6-month or 2-year research agenda to take these types of invariances and code them one at a time to your learning algorithm. And you can write papers, you can keep going, but then after you've encoded these 5 or 6 invariances, everyone hits the same brick wall, right? So I think in the short term, you code these things up to encode these invariances, that's great. But there are all these other types of invariances, like out of plane rotation. So if I rotate my face this way, I'm still the same person, right? Or more complex, like deformable parts, like the fact that I move my arm in a deformable way, I'm still the same person. Those types of invariances, we don't know how to hand code. So there's this trade-off. Do you want to code out what you know and then maybe hit a brick wall and then you need to learn things anyway? Or do you want to try to learn everything? And I think there are actually valid things with both approaches, but just be aware, if you're on the agenda of coding up the small list of invariances that we know how to code up, everyone hits the same brick wall. Other questions? Yeah.
Oh. One of the arguments in biology for sparse coding is that it's energy efficient. It doesn't take any energy to not fire a spike. But in a computational context where that doesn't matter, do you think you would get better performance if you relaxed sparsity, or do you think it's important to have it?
Yeah, so right. So one of the reasons for sparse coding is energetic efficiency. In the brain, it's much more energetically, just repeating a question of mine, it's much more energetically expensive to send a spike than send a pulse of electricity than to not do so. And this was, I think, Bruno and David's original motivation for sparse coding. So in the computational context, we don't have this constraint. Can we relax it? So Sean, I don't know. I think unsupervised speech learning is still a relatively new field, and we're all trying lots of different ideas. Sparsity seems to make our algorithms work much better. And for those of us, doing vision and audio, our main motivation for doing sparse coding has been the performance of the algorithms. I don't know. Maybe there are other principles that could do even better, but it's actually temporal coherence, a slow feature analysis, is one of our hypotheses. Many groups hypothesis. So don't really know. It turns out that there's some fascinating work on computer hardware where it turns out to be more energetically efficient too. And if we end up using those types of hardware, sorry, it is don't know, open field.
So, I think one more question, or we have to cut it off for the questions for this talk and pick them up in poster sessions or the break. We can do one more.
Sure.
So I wanted to just take a little bit of issue with the word unsupervised, and just on the same line of question as to what exactly we tell the algorithm. In vision, for example, is the notion of a patch. Is that reasonable to include as part of your algorithm, because that essentially says that we can learn something from the local neighbors of a.
Yeah, right. So sure, fair enough. So in unsupervised, so you're taking issue with the word unsupervised and the fact that we encode, the local topography of a patch. So I'm happy to encode that amount of prior knowledge. So what we're doing is we're essentially telling the algorithm which pixels are adjacent to which other input pixels. So this is a type of prior knowledge that we did encode into the algorithm. We haven't really explored algorithms, that it turns out that the algorithms are much more scalable if you actually tell it which pixels are next to which pixels. There's, evidence in the brain that's suggestive that the way your brain gets images actually captures the adjacent information as well. It turns out these algorithms work just fine if you make some local reshuffling of the pixels. It's actually surprisingly robust to that. But I agree, this is a type of information that we code to the algorithm. And with that, I think we should wrap up and pass it to Kai. So let me just say again, thank you very much.